Welcome, everyone, to the Co-Creators Convergence Thursday night Creator Convo. I'm Noel Marshall, and I'm here with my beloved.
Hi, everybody. This is Bob. It's Thursday night again. In the universe, we have at the Co-Creators Convergence the delight of having Vicki with us tonight to talk about her gift to the shifting humanity, or her current gift to the shifting humanity, because she has so many. We're delighted you're here, Vicki, and looking forward to feedback from folks live with us tonight on Facebook, in the Zoom room, and all those that'll be watching recordings later. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Vicki. And let me give her formal title, Reverend Dr. Vicki Garlock. So she is a very learned professional and will be sharing, we get asked so much, and I ask so much, what about the youth? What can we do for the youth? So I'm really looking forward to this evening because this woman is a wealth of information, creativity, and books, and we're going to learn about those. So before we begin, I do want to tell you a little bit about the Co-Creators Convergence and the fantastic guests that we have coming up. We're here every Thursday night. So hold on, let me show you this. So welcome, everyone. And I'm really excited to welcome back our guest, Reverend Dr. Vicki Garlock. And we actually met Vicki. I think you were part of our Unity and Peace Week that we did, I think in 2020 or 2021. And I just fell in love with her. I've been following her ever since. And one of these days, we're going to get over to Asheville and meet again in person. Just such a delightful person with so much to share. And let me tell you, give you a little more formal introduction. She is founder of World Religions for Kids, offering age-appropriate, non-devotional resources to help parents, grandparents, educators, Noel and Bob, and faith communities share the beauty of the world's religions with the kids in their lives. She is award-winning author of several kids' books, including We All Have Sacred Spaces. I love that book. She gifted me a copy of that. Yay. Embracing Peace is another. And the recently released ABCs of the World's Religions. She lives her multi-faith life in Asheville, North Carolina. So you can contact Vicki Garlock at worldreligions4kids.com. So Vicki, thank you so much for coming, being our guest tonight. Very excited to have you here. And I am at your service. So whatever you want me to do, you can screen share. It would be nice if you could bring us into a little centering. I've had a really hectic day. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, and then we'll be off to the races with whatever.
All right. That sounds good.
And I know it's going to be good. Thank you, Vicki.
Thank you. Okay, yes, we've all had a hectic day, I'm sure, because that's the way life is right now. So yes, let's take a moment. You can close your eyes if that's comfortable for you. Feel your feet on the ground. Feel your feet digging down into the earth. connecting with the earth, connecting with what's solid, connecting with the same earth that everyone around the world is connecting with, and connecting with the same earth that people have been connecting with for centuries, for millennia. Take a deep breath in and exhale. One of the things I'm going to be talking about tonight, I'm going to be talking about gratitude, and we're going to be talking about neighbors. And so one of the reasons I'm talking about that is to bring in this notion of, I think they are both important notions for how we can achieve peace. So that's what I really want to ultimately focus on tonight. And so I'd like just to take a moment, and I will give each of us just a little bit of time to just sit and center ourselves around the concept of peace, spreading the notion of peace first within our own hearts, and then spreading our peace out into the community and out into the world. So let's just take a few minutes to breathe together quietly, and center ourselves around the notion of peace. And as we continue to do that, I want us to send out special energy to all the people who are suffering from warfare, from extremism, from governments that don't care about their people. And so keep breathing, and let's send some special energy in that direction. I'd also like for each of us to send some special energy to the earth, which sometimes seems a little angry at the way we're treating it, and to people who are suffering from what we've done to the earth, to all the living beings that are suffering from what we've done to the earth. So let's breathe some peace into that. And finally, since I work with children, I always like to center ourselves around the lives of children, to breathe some peace into the joyful lives that they want to lead, to the meaningful work that their parents want to have, to achieving success, whatever that means for them and in their culture and in their lives and in their world, and breathing some peace into alleviating their suffering. Many, many children around the world are suffering in various ways every single day. So here at the end, I'd like us to just breathe a little bit of peace directed towards directing our peaceful thoughts and our loving thoughts towards the world's children. And finally, I'd like to end with a Zoroastrian prayer that I recently found. one of the things that I think is interesting about it is that it brings up these ideas. And because it's a Zoroastrian prayer, these ideas shows us that these ideas have been around for thousands and thousands of years. So we continue to struggle with what it means to be human and to try to make humanness better. And so I'll close our little centering time with this Zoroastrian prayer, which is not very long. So you can just breathe while I read this to you. May peace triumph over discord here, generous giving over avarice, reverence over contempt, speech with truthful words over lying utterance. May the righteous order gain the victory. And with that, I will welcome you to our session tonight. Thank you so much for being here. So yeah, I'm gonna talk about gratitude and neighbors a little bit, and I'm happy to keep it informal and answer questions along the way. And I'll talk a little bit about how I see gratitude and how I see neighbors, but also how we try to instill those values in children. So I guess I'll start with one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking with children about is who is your neighbor, right? And when we look at sort of evolutionary psychology, most people are familiar with this, is that there was this real us versus them mentality, right? And as the world has become a smaller place, what that means for us is that we actually encounter many more people who are different from ourselves. And one of the questions then is sort of what do we do about that? We hear a lot in the current culture about intersectionalities, right? And as it turns out, there are so many different things that are influence who we are. And so what this means is that people can have connections with people who are like them in very small ways. Maybe you like sports, right? Or in very deep and profound ways by being a member of a similar community, right? And so one of the things that we're trying to teach children, and it's not so easy because adults don't always understand it either, is that literally 8 billion people on the planet, 8 billion people are your neighbors. And so we spend a lot of time talking to kids about how to recognize that everyone is their neighbor. And it can be really difficult when someone seems very different from you. A lot of times we determine who's our neighbor by how they look, right? So one of the first things we have to do is talk to kids about everyone being their neighbor, regardless of how they look. There was this I was talking to a colleague recently. There was an interesting sort of demonstration. I won't call it an experiment. It was a demonstration that we used to do with intro to psychology students when I was a professor of psychology. And it was really used to talk about nature versus nurture, right? So when you read about identical twins, one of the things that people tend to notice about identical twins is that they have a lot of things in common, right? And once you start finding those commonalities and those similarities, they seem to just keep coming. And it's just like, oh my gosh, there's so much the same. Oh my gosh, there's so much the same. So one of the ways that we sort of get students to look at that a little more critically was we would put students in pairs. And we would just get them to think about all the ways in which they were similar to one another, right? And so, these were college students. So they talked about all kinds of crazy stuff. But what they ended up finding in the course of about 10 or 15 minutes was they had so many things in common with each other. Right? Even like silly things like what kind of toothpaste they used, right? And so one of the things that was supposed to come out of that particular demonstration was that any two people have a lot of similarities, and it might not be because they're identical twins, and it might not be because of their genetics, right? But when I left academia, I was a psychology professor for 11 years, a full-time psychology professor for 11 years. And then I switched and moved into a church, and I developed a multi-faith curriculum there at Jubilee Community Church. I actually took that demonstration with me. And one of the things we did with it was we had middle schoolers pair up with one another. And these were kids who didn't go to the same school. They only knew each other because they were coming to Jubilee Church on Sunday morning. And we sort of, kind of gave them a few prompts to get them going. But one of the things that we now use that for, completely different context, completely different point that we're trying to make, is how easy it is to find similarities with someone that you think you have nothing in common with when you just try. When you give yourself space to do that, when you give yourself, and that 10 minutes, literally 10, 15 minutes, you can come up with all these similarities that you have. And there are many stories, there are many ancient stories, right, of people coming together and thinking that they have all these differences, and then finding out that they're not so different after all. And so this is one of the exercises that we like to do with middle schoolers to get them to really realize that, we have more similarities with people than we might think. So it's not always an easy thing to do. And I think as adults, right, we tend to have sometimes a lot of issues moving beyond. We might have fewer issues moving beyond skin color or what people wear. But as we're seeing right now, for adults, it can be really difficult to recognize that, yes, everyone is our neighbor, even people who don't vote the same way that we do. And there was an article recently, I would say it was about 6 months ago, actually, where the author had, he's sick, and he's a turban wearing Sikh, and he had broken down in the middle of, I don't know where, the middle of nowhere. And so he was stuck in this gas station mechanic repair shop, right, with people who seemed really, really different than he was. And he started out being pretty nervous about being stuck there as a Sikh in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of America with a turban on. But there they were. He had no choice, but he was waiting there to get his car fixed. And so, as many of us have experienced, sitting around waiting for our car, you end up talking with the people next to you. And sure enough, the guy started talking about his grandchild. The sick man started talking about his child. And it didn't take very long for them to realize that even though they're different religions, they probably vote differently, that they have had a lot of similarities in common. In this sense, yeah, that people want their children to be successful, whatever that means in that culture. Children want their parents want their children to be happy, and people want to have meaningful work. And the question is, what we disagree on is sort of how to get there. So, does anyone have any questions, or does anyone have anything they want to share about trying to get kids to think about who their neighbor is?
You asked me if I've ever done anything like that, and I was just marveling at this simple exercise that you suggested, and I jotted it down as something I want to do in the future, because I teach world religions, and I feel like it would be a great opening to just introduce that whole idea. I love the idea. I can't think of anything that I've done in the past on that, but this is definitely something I want to try in the future. I love it.
One of the things that's really nice about it is if you just sit, and I can actually send you some prompts, but if you sit and give them a few ideas to get them started, like what toothpaste do you use? Like, not big ideas, just like little ideas, right? Like, what music do you like to listen to? Or is there anybody you follow on TikTok, right? Things like that. If you give them a few of those, what's really cool about this exercise is they will take that and they will run with it. And so what ends up happening is that you end up not actually teaching them per se that they have a lot of similarities with this person. They actually end up coming to it on their own. Right. So that's that's one of the things that's cool about it. Like, we're always trying to think of things where it's not us telling them you have a lot of similarities with each other and you just don't realize it. Right. It's somehow trying to create the space and create the energy for them to sort of come to that on their own. And yes, and I was telling Noel and Bob beforehand that, you know, a lot of the things that we do with kids, parents and their grown-ups could actually use too. But my experience is parents are way more difficult. I was telling them, you know, I always tell people, you can't pay me enough to actually work with adults. I much prefer the children. They're so much easier. But anyway, yeah. So yeah.
It looks like, Sheila, did you want to jump into the conversation here?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's in some ways, this is just so obvious, and yet so weird for most people when we're in our tribal ways. I love that you mentioned that you know, we have so much in common no matter how we vote. That isn't the only thing that so many people seem to gravitate towards right now. But I remember there being a program called Avatar. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but and it may be other places, this prayer that begins with, and just like me, this person, and then just fill in the blank. Just like me, this person has worries. This person, you know, just like me, this person wants to make a good living, like you were saying, all the things we have in common.
Yeah. So the other games, you know, that game, well, sometimes it's called like The Wind Blows, I think it's called. Sometimes there's a lot of different versions of it. But you can have people, any age people. We've played it with kids as young as probably second or third grade, all the way up to adults, right? It's called The Big Wind Blows. That's what it's called. And so you're standing in a circle and one person says something and they just say, the big wind blows for everyone who likes ice cream, right? And so anyone who likes ice cream, then you have to, you know, move to another point in the circle, right? So everybody's sort of crisscrossing in the center of the circle. And so, you know, you can imagine you can come up with like all kinds of crazy things that, you know, you can think of to say, right? But the point is that sometimes you say weird things like the big wind blows for anybody who's been to Arkansas, and you find out that, oh my gosh, that person's been to Arkansas too. How else would you know? And so one of the reasons why it works well is because it's not particularly verbal, right? So for people who don't want to sit and talk a lot about stuff, right? Boys especially, not always, but boys like to move, right? So it's a way to show your commonalities while you also get to move around, and you only have to think of one thing, you know, every once in a while, because it goes around the circle. So Big Wind Blows is a good game. But have any of you ever been in, you know, I used to be when I was a professor, they would bring in these facilitators, right, to run faculty retreat. Okay. And, you know, sometimes there was some issue we were working on, like, oh, what were we going to do with gen ed requirements or something really tedious like that, because professors like to be as tedious as they can possibly be. So they would bring these mediators in, and they would I don't know if any of you have ever done it. I imagine some of you probably have. And they would put one alternative on one side of the wall and one alternative on the other side of the wall. And we would all stand in the middle, and they'd say, okay, how many people think that we should change gen ed requirements to include whatever? And then you walk over to this side or you walk over to that side, right? And so that's a way that, you know, people do it with grownups. But I think the ways we do it with kids are more fun. And I would argue that we should use those methods with grownups more often.
Well, as a grown-up, I would like to play those games. Okay.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Always
good.
Always,
all right. You can come to my party, Noel.
Yeah.
Play those games
You
together.
just came up with
Right?
You just came up with a new introductory process for next year's Co-Creators Convergence event in the world that is.
Okay, well, there you go. It's been around for a long time, so you don't have to credit me. I think it's one of those games that people played like in the 70s, right? Like, you know, those old game books. Yeah, I think it's been around for a really long time. So I did not make it up.
It looks like Carol wants to jump into the conversation here.
Yes, Miss Carol.
Well, I'll jump in from where I am, which is not working in groups right now, but living in a neighborhood in a part of Toronto where 71% of the population are second generation, first, second generation Canadians, so-called visible, once called visible minorities, now the visible majority. And so it just in a neighborhood where I go shopping for groceries, and lots of refugees in our neighborhood as well, for reasons I won't take up time with. But the point being, if I go shopping and I may be reaching for tea at the same time as somebody of a different culture, of a different creed, of a different language is looking for tea. And I thought to myself later about approaching the grocery stores and seeing if there couldn't be welcomers, helpers, some way of crossing the great lonely divide. This went a little different place than I thought I was going to go, but I'll stop right there. Just to say that just living in this neighborhood, I'm looking for ways to meet with the diversity of the world is right here.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things I could actually say in response to that. You know, so one of the things that comes to mind is that yes, Toronto, we all know, is a big multicultural, you know, most sort of multinational city. But I have this sort of interesting story. I had someone who, this was about a year or two ago, and he was Jewish, and he lived somewhere in kind of like a small town in North Carolina. And somehow he got in touch with a friend of mine who's also Jewish. She was president of her synagogue at the time. And he said, my Jewish brother who lives in a small town in Virginia is really Islamophobic. He says horrible things about Muslims. And he said, it makes me kind of feel badly. And I feel his pain, and I don't want him to have that pain anymore. President of the synagogue, if you could give me any suggestions. And she said, yes, I will give you a suggestion. You need to talk to Vicki Garlock. She's going to help you figure this out. So he contacts me. Somehow we end up talking on the phone, right? And he's sort of explaining his situation, his brother's situation, all this kind of stuff. And I finally said to him, I said, well, the best way to start addressing Islamophobia is for your brother to actually meet some Muslims, right? And find out, oh my gosh, Muslims are people too. And so I said, where did you say he lived again? And he named this small town that's on the southern border of Virginia, the northern border of North Carolina. There's nothing there. There's absolutely nothing there. But when I Googled mosque near this town, there was a mosque in that small town. And I said, you need to tell your brother that there is actually a mosque in his small town in Virginia. And he said, you're kidding me. And I said, I just Googled it. I'm sitting here looking at Google Maps on my computer. And I said, he can contact the imam. He can go. He can actually meet people who are Muslim in his small town. And so, you know, one of the things that we're seeing, right, and is that even in small towns across America and certainly across Canada as well, is that there's a huge amount of diversity. And I would gently suggest that this is part of the reason why we have the divisiveness that we have, right? Is the fear response to that extent of diversity, that level of diversity that feels to some people like it's just everywhere. It's in your face. et cetera, et cetera. But for those of us in the business that, that we're all in, right, we can sort of take advantage of this to forge those connections. Someone was telling me, and I don't know if it's true because I don't have the research on it, but a Jewish woman was telling me recently, like a couple of weeks ago, that colleges and universities that already had interfaith groups in place, right, where they did things together, they did multi-faith things together, were faring much better under the current conditions with the Middle East war than colleges that did not have strong interfaith groups. And I don't know if that was just her impression, that was just her hope. But anyway, she said colleges that have good interfaith groups already in place are faring better. And so unfortunately, the situation that we're in now, specifically with the war in the Middle East, let me back up and say, it's kind of like when you raise your kids, right? A lot of times you can't sort through problems when everybody's upset, right? When everybody's emotional and everybody's angry, right? You just kind of gotta, hang on. And then and then talk about it the next day when everybody's calm. But what's even better is if you could have already talked about it before, right? So that what you're doing is just revisiting, you've got a foundation there. And so that's what we need to have in place, right? Because unfortunately, I don't know, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, probably we're not going to have world peace in my lifetime. 30 years ago, I might have bet on that, but I'm kind of old now. And so I'm thinking maybe not, right? So let's assume that there are going to continue to be wars, right? So we are fighting and conflict. And so the more connections we can make over tea, the more connections we can make over toothpaste, the more connections we can make in a small town in Virginia, right? The better off we're going to be the next time that there's conflict, whatever that looks like.
Vicki, I have a question. Do you find it easier for the children to accept differences, to find similarities and accept differences? And does that somehow go up the chain to the parents? Or do you find your work goes up?
Yes.
Work? Talk a little bit about that.
Well,
I'd like to hear
so
more.
sometimes it goes up. I mean, that's my hope, right? So I have a couple of little stories about that too. So I went to a Lutheran grade school and a Catholic high school. I grew up in a very small town in Illinois, corn country. And so all of my high school friends are Catholic, right? I was raised Lutheran, but all of my high school friends are Catholic. And so for a long time, I didn't post a lot of stuff about my work on Facebook because I had a lot of Facebook friends from my high school, and I was afraid that my work, my multi-faith work, would offend them in some way. And as we all know, you accidentally offend people on social media, but I try not to intentionally offend people on social media. And at some point, it just felt too insincere, right? It just felt like I wasn't really being myself. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to have to start putting some of this stuff out there because I have other Facebook friends who would be interested, I think. So I started putting stuff out there. And what was incredible about it was really how supportive my high school friends have been. And part of the reason is because they know that they don't know about other religions, right? But they don't really know how to go about learning, and they're not going to put out a lot of effort at it, but they are aware that they don't know about other religions. Growing up, we had one single synagogue in my hometown, right? That synagogue has shut down, but what is there instead? An Islamic center in Kankakee, Illinois, which has 30,000 people living there, right? And so again, right, even in a small town in the middle of corn country, right, there's this level of diversity. So one of my friends said to me, well, I'm going to buy your book. We all have sacred spaces, right? And she said, I'm going to buy that book. And I said, well, Sandy, I said that, that book is for an 8-year-old. And she said, I know, but she said, I learned so much from it. And so that's one thing that happens, right? Is literally grown-ups tell me how much they learn from my books, which is great. So they read it. And that's what I tell people. You don't need to know about world religions to teach kids about world religions. You can just use my books or, use any number of other resources that are out there, because as long as you're willing to explore with your kids. And I tell people there's lots of things that parents don't have all the answers to, right? We talk to kids all the time about stuff we don't have answers to. Like, a good example is death, right? Most kids at some point ask about death. Their grandparent dies, the dog dies, the fish dies. It comes up, right? I mean, the surest thing about life is death. And so we all the time, it comes up, and we know we don't know everything about death, right? And yet we would never avoid talking about it. And so I always tell people there's, a lot of issues about racism and indigenous people where, a lot of us in our generation, we're learning, right? We're still learning. There's a lot of history there, hundreds of years of history. The same thing with the Middle East situation. I mean, thousands of years of history on that land, right? So we talk to kids all the time about things that we don't have all the answers to, right? So we tend to get awfully uptight about religion. And so what I'm trying to convince people of is we don't need to get that uptight. We need to be respectful, but we don't need to be that uptight. It's okay not to have all the answers, and it's okay to explore with kids. But I had one of the first thing I published was actually the peace unit of my curriculum. And so it was lesson plans, right? And they were all focused on peace, and it was a story and a craft and an activity. And I still do, I marketed it to progressive type Christian churches. So there was a woman at a Methodist church in what we call here the upstate, which is northern South Carolina, right on the border between North Carolina and South Carolina. And it was just a Methodist church. And she wanted to use my curriculum, but not on Sunday morning. So what they did was she wanted to have their regular Sunday school classes on Sunday morning. So they used my multi-faith peace curriculum on their Wednesday night program. Right. And that was more intergenerational, and it was more families. And so one night they did the peace story from the Islamic tradition, and they did a little camel craft, and it was all just like any other night. But the next week, one of the dads who had stayed with his kids, one of the dads said that it made a really big difference to him, and that it all of a sudden opened his eyes to what Islam might be about. So, he was just sitting on the sidelines as a parent. And so, yes, sometimes it does work up. As far as kids go, it's my experience with kids is that they know a lot, but there's also a lot they don't know. And they're spending a lot of time during the day just trying to figure it out. The example that I always use is prayer. So when we would talk to the kids at Jubilee Church about prayer, right? And often it was in the context of Lent with Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? And that was sort of the baseline story. And then we would go out from there. And we would sort of get to the point, even with like first and second graders or kindergartners, where, one way you can pray is you can fold your hands and you can pray to God the Father, right? Or you could have prayer flags. And there were prayer flags all around. The kids could make prayer flags, right? You could have a prayer wheel, right? Some people say meditation is prayer, right? In the creation spirituality tradition, right? Anything creative and artistic, right? That is considered prayer. And the kids were just like, oh yeah, okay, sure. Prayer in the garden, prayer wheels, prayer flags, meditation is prayer. They just went right along with it. So I think we have opportunities, right? As I often tell people, my job is to not wreck it, right? So to just let them be who they're going to be, right? And give them some sort of positive, open-hearted ways, because they are naturally like that. Right. And somewhere along the way, we end up creating situations and scenarios that cause people to close in, right? And so if we can keep them open-minded and open-hearted for as many years as possible, right? And to keep bringing these messages back around, and that's what I think. I don't know that they're better at it than grown-ups, but you know, life has not taken its toll. I mean, we could just put it that way, right?
Right,
So,
right.
yeah.
Thank you for that. I was also wondering about if you would share with us what inspired you for your book Sacred Spaces, and how do you use that in your curriculum?
Yeah, so in general, right? So what I'm trying to do is break down the traditional silos, right? Break down the traditional boundaries that we have with these different religious traditions, right? And I get it. They are not the same. They came into being at different points in world history. They articulate the divine in different ways, right? And they have different rituals and different rules and different tenets. I get all of that. I got it. But if we back up just a little bit, what we can see is that religions in nearly all cases are trying to address the fundamental issues of being human, right? And that's why we can say a Zoroastrian prayer in 2023, right? Because what are they talking about? They're talking about greed versus generosity, right? They're talking about peace versus conflict. They're talking about, I mean, right speech, right? So in this prayer, they called it speech with truthful words. The Buddha calls it right speech. I mean, so we got a problem in human nature, right? People lie. It doesn't work. It's not what we should be doing. We all know we're not supposed to lie, right? And so what I'm suggesting in my own way is that if we back up just a little bit and we look at some of these overarching themes, right? Like peace, like compassion, like awe and wonder, right? Like how do we deal with anger and lying and those kinds of emotions, right? Greed. How do we deal with, you know, the Catholics call them the 7 deadly sins, right? But the Catholic, they weren't the first people to think about this, right? Because all over the course of human history, these are the issues we're trying to deal with. And so when you do that, it becomes very easy to see how religions are similar, right? Which is why the peace unit of my curriculum, the peace stories. And one of the things that humans do is they create sacred spaces, right? They create spaces where they can gather, where the situation, the circumstances are set up for connection with the divine presence, right? Where you can learn, teaching and learning happens there. And so sacred spaces is just one of the ways, I think, in which we can begin to look at not just the differences between them, but the similarities between them. And what happens in a book like Sacred Spaces is that you see similarities where you might not expect them, right? So if I just said to you, what do Hinduism and Islam have in common? You might actually take a minute on that one. But it turns out, very simply, you take your shoes off before you go into both of those sacred spaces, right? And so in a place where, you know, you wouldn't necessarily think that there are commonalities, there are. And so something like Sacred Spaces is a way for me to get at keep the differences, but also recognize if you back up a little bit, there are some really interesting similarities. So that's what I do. Since we're on the topic, this is my new book. I'll show, this is ABCs of the World's Religions, right? And so some of the letters, basically what I do is each letter of the alphabet gets a 2-page spread, right? So on the left-hand page, I use a little rhyming couplet, like for little kids. And then on the right-hand page, I explore the concept a little bit more. And so I'll just give an example. And some of them are pretty straightforward, like B is for the Buddha, C is for Christmas, D is for Diwali. But there were several other letters where I could sort of take advantage of these commonalities across traditions. For example, F is for fasting, right? F is for fasting. And so the rhyming couplet goes like this. F is for fasting, which means you don't eat. No fruits, no veggies, no dairy, and no meat. But on the right-hand side of the page, I can talk about all the different traditions where fasting is a practice, right? So it allows me to sort of begin to break down those barriers. Not every single page. A is for altar. I get to talk about all the different religious traditions that use altars, right? G is for guru. I can talk about all the different religious traditions where the guru concept is important. One that really surprises people is that R is for relics. And so what's interesting about relics is that most religious traditions have relics. But when you talk to Muslims about relics, they only know about Islamic relics. When you talk to Christians, they only know about Christian relics. And when you talk to Buddhists, they only know about Buddhist relics. And so nobody has any idea that everybody's got relics, right? And so this is a way to, this is a way to teach kids. And actually one of my biggest markets is turning out to be grandparents. So this is a good way to teach kids and their grandparents about all the religious traditions. So that's what prompted me, was partly to show people that there were some pretty easy ways to break down those barriers. But also part of it was that, I have two kids. My kids are young adults now. My son is 17 and my daughter is 23. But when they were younger, I couldn't really find the books that I was looking for, right? And so I could find specific books. There are lots of books about Jewish holy days. There's a lot of books about Hindu holy days, but I couldn't find books where the different religious traditions were sort of dealt with in a fair way, kind of from the outside perspective. And many of those books within the religious silos, not all of them, but a lot of them, they have an agenda, right? Which is to keep kids within that silo, right? Jews want to raise Jewish kids, Christians want to raise Christian kids, et cetera, et cetera. And so to try to just create the book that I was hoping to find. And, a lot of people talk about, I think that one of the things, there's a lot of statistics now, right? About high school girls getting their hijab torn off, or Sikh kids getting their turban torn off, right? Bullying kinds of incidents. We have big national organizations who do research every year on bullying incidents. So yeah, absolutely. We all know bullying is horrible, right? Okay, so one hope is that my books will help prevent some of those bullying incidents, right? But what is, even back to our topic, what is probably more pervasive than bullying? Okay, we all know bullying is bad. Don't get me wrong. We all know bullying is bad. But one of the things that's more pervasive than bullying is just neighbors who don't know neighbors, right? So how do we, do what Carol's talking about, right? Which is just to know our neighbors. And I think that, again, if people buy my books, not for bullying, just to know their neighbors better, then I think that I will have made my little small contribution to the world, right? So.
Bob, you're muted.
Anybody else? Does anybody else want to? I mean, I can keep talking about whatever people want to talk about, but I'm happy if you have questions.
Let me, Vicki, let me give my question. I've been so intent on listening. This is so wonderful that my question is not fully formed. So I'll babble from.
I'm good with that.
Is that everything that you've described, everything that you've been doing is about being on the, for lack of a better word, on the offense of teaching children and, oh, by the way, their grandparents or their parents.
Right.
And through different institutions, be they churches or wherever, organizations. What has been your experience with young people, kids that have been biased by their family unit, by their parents, their grandparents? Just say, hypothetically, there's a country in the world where They claim to be a democracy, and then a new president is elected, and that person decides everybody that's Muslim should not be allowed in our country because because all of them are bad. That's a religion. All of the people in that religion are bad. And the kids are watching the evening news, or they're hearing their parents comment on the evening news, quote news.
Yep.
And have you had any experience with the tools that you use, the circles you move in, the talents that you bring to people, confronting or dealing with very specifically people being programmed to assume that there's a religion that's bad?
Yeah. So I'm going to give you the short answer, which is no. I don't have very much experience with that. So, and there's kind of good and bad things about that. So the reason I think that I haven't had much experience with that is because I work in a pretty narrow lane, right? And so I am like going to Parliament of World Religions, right, where everybody thinks is all great. And I work in progressive Christian churches. When I'm working in churches, they're very progressive Christian churches. And there is sort of an array of beliefs about the divine and about God, about Christianity, about Trinitarianism, all of that stuff. But when you really look at it, it's a pretty narrow set, right? And so there's no doubt that I run in, let's just say, a very biased small sample of the world. Now, having said that, so definitely much more work to be done. And if you look at some of the reconciliation work, either race reconciliation, or there have been stories of religious reconciliation, right? Where people have really changed their minds about Sikhs in particular. There's some people who work with that, and also like Seeds for Peace and some of these Palestinian Israeli groups that have been around for a very long time, right? What you see is that reconciliation work takes a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of really coordinated effort and desire to make that reconciliation happen. So those are not the spaces that I'm in. Someone once asked me, they said, well, what do evangelical Christians say about your work? And I said, well, as far as I know, they say nothing about it. Because they aren't calling me, right? They aren't emailing me. They aren't calling me. Are they buying my books? How would I know? But what's that? Oh, so I think that my take on it is that, there's so much work to be done. And, all of us who are doing what we do in the spaces that we do them in, it's helpful. Right? Because we're really very much on the front end of doing this work, I think. And so to me, like no one is my competition. I'm like, the more multi-faith stuff we have, the more different age groups we have, the more people doing this work, the better off we all are. A rising tide raises all boats, right? So that is very much my philosophy about this. And I tell people, I'm like, listen, I run in a very narrow lane, right? And I'm happy to be in that lane, and I love what I do. But yeah, I would say that at this point, I have not been involved in that work. Not that I wouldn't want to be, but yeah.
Sure. And thank you for that. And I'd like to hear more also about the neighbors concept and getting to know neighbors. And we've been blessed that after 10 years of roaming about the country with purpose or just meandering, we ended up in a neighborhood, in a subdivision in Northeast Tennessee. And we're blessed that we knew a couple of the direct neighbors because we bought my mom's house when she passed. And so we had met those neighbors when we came to visit her. So we automatically dropped right into a neighborhood. Then some people were proud enough to put flags in their yards and signs in their yards in our neighborhood that would indicate that they support political candidates that have views that are 1,000% opposite of our worldview and view of the nation. And so I'd like to hear more about that because it gave me an opportunity to realize, I always knew them as nice neighbors that were very kind to my elderly mother and cut the grass and shovel snow once every third year and things like that. And so I strike conversation with them that's based on what we have in common in the neighborhood. And it's a little weird for Noel and I to say, and no, I'm going to a church thing tonight, or I'm doing this, that, and the other, because for many years we weren't going to any church, spiritual centers and other places. But the opportunity is there, knowing that they go to church, but I don't know what flavor church they go to. There's a conversation opener for me to ask them about what church they go to or what their faith belief is or whatever, and vice versa. There's the opportunity for them to ask me. And so I'd just like to hear more about your experiences with the neighborhood, adults in the neighborhood idea. We ain't got many kids in our neighborhood. It's been around for 45 years. And so the generation that we're all first homeowners in the neighborhood went away a generation ago. Now they come back with their grandkids. So talk about that a little, if you would.
Okay. So one thing I would say is that, you know, one of the things you said was that you had always known them as nice neighbors who were nice to your mother, right? And then they put signs out in their yards. And what I would suggest to you is that they are still nice neighbors who were nice to your mother, right? And so so it's good to keep that in mind. Right. So my I believe it or not, I'm a somewhat of a disappointment to my parents because my political voting and my political beliefs are very different from theirs. And so I will just tell you that my father was the youngest member of the Young Republicans. He joined when he was 12, and he is now, which is also the age at which he started smoking cigarettes. And he is now 85. So he did stop smoking when he was 70, right? So I've been having conversations with people who are very nice and very loving and vote way differently than I do for all of my adult life, right? So the second thing I would say is you might want to ask them what kind of toothpaste they eat. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just joking. So, you know, the old phrase, right? Fences make good neighbors, right? But the only way, and this goes back to what, you know, Carol's supermarket thing, which is such a meaningful moment for me, is that someone has to reach over the fence, right? Someone has to do that. And so I do that across religious traditions. So I realized many years ago that it was not fair to ask someone, okay, if I'm Christian or even sort of, you know, kind of a halfway Christian, right? Depends on how you define Christian, right? I call myself Christian. A lot of other people don't. And that's the majority religion in the US, right? So it's not fair to ask Jewish people, Buddhist people, Muslim people, Hindu people to come into a church. They've been in churches. Every single person of a minority religion that I know has been in a church because you can't avoid them, right? You can't avoid them. And at some point, what I realized, and yet most of the adults that I know have never been into a sacred space other than that. I know really intelligent people with PhDs, people who worked with me at the college, right? Raised Catholic. And one woman in particular I'm thinking of said to me, oh my gosh, I've never been in a synagogue, right? I mean, she doesn't have anything against Jews. She's not anti-Semitic. She was just raised Catholic in Indiana and she got her PhD and now she works in a college. And why would she ever be in a synagogue? So what I realized was that it was up to me. It was up to me to go to them, right? And 100% of the time, people are amazingly welcoming, right? So if everybody's just staying on their side of the fence, right, no progress is made, right? And so yes, remembering that they are still nice people who have their own ideas about how they're going to vote. They were still nice to your mother, and someone's got to reach out. One of the things that always happens almost every year during Passover, there's this funny thing that goes around. on social media. Usually I see it on Twitter or X or whatever we call it now. And it's that a Jewish person puts on Twitter that one of their neighbors brought them some challah bread to help them celebrate Passover. Well, of course, Passover is when you eat unleavened bread, right? So no Jew eats challah on Passover, right? That's like actually the wrong thing to give people on Passover. And then they talk about how amazing it was and that, yeah, it was a mistake and it's the wrong thing to give on Passover, but how much it meant to them. And they couldn't eat it, but they were so happy that their neighbors knew it was Passover and they knew they were Jewish and they wanted to do something nice for them. And so there's a new book out, which I haven't had a chance to read yet, but I was messaging on Facebook with one of the authors or the editors, and it's Interreligious Mistakes, right? And I was saying, I can hardly wait to read this book because I have my own set of stories about interreligious mistakes, right? But it's all fine, right? It's all, it works itself out. And when people know that you're coming from your heart, it's kind of amazing what you can get away with. Let's just put it that way, right? It's amazing. I should probably say it's amazing how forgiving people are when they know that it's coming from your heart.
That's right.
That's a good book for the book club at the UU Church, obviously.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That would. I haven't read it yet, but I'm gonna read it. So, because it's probably got some funny stories in there. But yeah, I have some of my own. So.
Oh, that's great. I feel your next book coming out. So, Bob and I are part of United Religions Initiative.
Yeah.
URI, and our group, each group does whatever is germane to their community. Yep. And our particular group decided that every other month we were going to make a visit to a synagogue, a mosque, a high or whatever, and Greek Orthodox. And number one, I've been surprised at how many different religions there are in our area, Northeast Tennessee, where it's 92% of the same kind of people. Not a lot of diversity like Toronto. But I found that really fascinating, and they've always been welcoming, and the whole family is invited, and I really enjoyed that. But the other thing I want to bring up is that what about intergenerational dialogue? Because our minister, she had a talk the other last month, I think it was, and it was about intergenerational dialogue, and she said, do you realize that the church is one of the only places where different generations get together for an hour? And I never really thought of that. And I think that was very, I really had to think about that, that you could really, other than going out to dinner where everybody's watching the TV screens or their phones or their other things. And so we had a whole service, and people were paired up, the grandparent with a child they didn't know, a teenager with a youngster, the whole thing was all mixed up and had activity like that. But intergenerational dialogue, how can we promote that more?
Yeah, well, so this is this whole grandparent thing, right? Is because so yeah, you can use my books, but what we're seeing, and this is fascinating, is that a lot of people in their 60s and 70s were raised in a particular tradition. And of course, in America, it was most likely some version of Christianity, right? And then they had kids, and now their kids are in their 30s or early 40s having their own kids, and they don't care about religion, right? They don't go to church anywhere, and they're really busy, and everybody's working, and life is busy. And so now you have these grandparents that are concerned that their kids don't know anything about their religious tradition. Now you throw multi-faith families into there, right? So the percentage of multi-interfaith marriages now keeps going up, right? So now these kids have, like my kids have, one set of grandparents is Christian Jewish, and then my parents who are Christian, right? But you have a lot of sort of mixed religious families now, right? So just from the very beginning thing, right, trying to get kids to be able to navigate their parents' generation, right? The church that I work at now, the church that I used to work at, we hired Sunday school teachers, right? So they were often like college kids, right? And they were there every Sunday and they were paid to be there every Sunday. And one of the good things about it was they knew the kids. They saw the kids week after week. They knew kind of overall what we were trying to do in the program. And they knew the kids and they got to know them. The church where I work now is volunteers. So every week it's somebody different, right? It's a different teacher. And of course the kids don't come every Sunday. So it's a different set of kids. I mean, it's kind of crazy. But and so when I started there in August, they're like, we don't know how to do this. Like we don't, like, no one's going to sign up for this. Like, who's going to sign up for it? And we don't know how to teach Sunday school. And I said, listen, this is the best way for everybody to get to know each other. I said, these kids leave the church service and they're in Sunday school in the education building. And now nobody in the church service knows them. These kids are amazing. Like that's the selling point, right? You get to come and be with these kids, right? And so it's been great. And so it turns out there's all kinds of people at this church who used to teach Sunday school, right? Or they were like professors, or they were ministers, or they were ministers' kids. And so, yeah, one way to do it is just like, there you go. We just set it up and we just make it happen. This church also has the first Sunday of the month is Intergenerational Sunday. And the kids stay in the church service and there are craft tables set up in the back. And anybody can go to the craft table. And so a lot of times, just like, anybody, just old people, right? They go to the craft table and then all the kids are at the craft table. And so they're randomly paired up. They don't have to talk. It's still a church service, but they get to do crafts while the church service is going on. And so they get to connect sort of in this kind of physical, creative way without actually having to talk about anything. The other thing we're seeing now is intergenerational dialogue between, because old people don't think about their religious tradition in the same way as young people, right? And so, and I see that across religious traditions, right? So people in their 60s and 70s who were raised in a tradition and were raised with particular rituals, or going to church every Sunday or whatever that looks like, going to Hebrew school every Saturday, right? Now kids don't do that. And so this intergenerational dialogue within religious traditions is really important, right? So because it helps with understanding where people are coming from, right? And so we see this with the Jewish population right now, where the grandparents remember the Holocaust. They remember the Holocaust, or they knew people who died in the Holocaust, or people who survived the Holocaust, right? And their 16-year-old grandson or even great grandson doesn't care at all about the Holocaust. Like, what does the Holocaust have to do with him, right? And so, but I see this, that's one of the more obvious examples in the moment. But I see this across religious traditions. So the intergenerational stuff is really important, but I would also say that there are ways to connect without talking about it. So, you just bake bread together or whatever, I don't know. But I do think food is a really helpful thing in that respect, right? Where you sort of teach your old recipes, right? Like my Nana's Dutch apple cake, right? But that's not particularly religious. But if you can, you'd use cooking, right? Or you use some sort of craft, or you get out your family heirloom, a menorah or whatever. So I think that there are ways to do that as well, again, without sort of talking, right? With sort of sharing in some way.
This has been so wonderful, Vicki. And what I'd like you to do in the time we have left, would you go through each one of your books and just kind of give us a little how they developed and how they came about, how they were birthed. How's that?
And how they were birthed. Okay.
I want everybody to know about all the good work you've been putting out there.
Oh, well, thank you. So I was I was going to actually stand up here and I was looking around to see if I had a copy of, let me get a copy of my curriculum. I'll show that too. Hang on.
Oh, yes, yes, absolutely. And while she's doing that, Bob has put in the chat, you can find out about Vicki's books at worldreligions, the number 4kids.com/children's-books. So you can find it there.
Thank you, Bob.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when I was at Jubilee Community Church, I developed, part of my job there was to develop a multi-year, multi-age, multi-faith curriculum, right? And so I was doing that. I did that every week for 10 years, 11 years. And so at some point I decided that other people might be interested. So the first thing that I actually published was this, which is called Interfaith Made Easy. And it was the peace unit of my curriculum. And it's 4 volumes, right? So it's preschool, kindergarten, lower elementary, upper elementary, and this was the middle school volume, right?
Wow.
And each volume is 15 lesson plans. Half of them are stories from the Christian Bible, and half of them are stories from other traditions. And it's a typical curriculum in that it has stories, but it also has crafts and activities that are related, and each story is standalone. And so that was the first thing I published, and it came out in 2018 and 2019. And then the pandemic hit and all churches shut down and there were no kids programs. So the timing on that wasn't the best, I will say that. And I also lost my job in March of 2020 when Jubilee Church shut down. I lost my job, and as it all turned out, I never got it back. But it kind of seemed like maybe I was going to get it back. Nobody knew what was going to happen. And so I thought, well, as long as I'm sitting here, maybe I should learn how to publish a book, right? And so I taught myself InDesign, which I never wanted to do. I created We All Have Sacred Spaces, right? And so this book, what I used was color photographs from around the world. So it looks at interior and exteriors of spaces, indigenous, Hindu spaces, Buddhist spaces, Christian, Jewish, Islamic, and Sikh spaces. So 7 different faith traditions. And I used real world images, and I sat around and literally looked at thousands of images to pick the ones that I thought would be the most interesting to kids and that would tell a story. And so, yes, this is We All Have Sacred Spaces is the book that my friend from high school bought and said that she learned so much from it. Then I still didn't have my job back. So I thought, oh, well, I could, and I would love to publish more of these. Like I have more ideas, like we all honor our ancestors. We all love lights. We all eat special foods. We all read sacred texts, right? There's a lot of things, ways that I could take that concept and look at those ideas. But I still didn't have my job back. So I decided to take the peace stories from the curriculum and turn them into more of a storybook, right? And so that's the Embracing Peace, Stories from the World's Faith Traditions. And so these are all stories about peace that come from the different traditions. And you can see on the cover, right? Native American, Sikh, Sub-Saharan African, Islamic peace stories, right? And of course, the point is that there are peace stories in all of these traditions. And many of the stories are thousands of years old, right? So I wrote my own versions of the stories, and I have little boxes on the side that have thought questions and little tidbits about the religious tradition that the story comes from. And so, but they are all stories that, I started to wonder, like, how do Hindus teach kids about Hinduism? How do Buddhists teach their kids about Buddhism? Like, I know how we do it in Christianity, right? You read a Bible story and then you do a craft and, there you go. Well, it turns out that when I actually went to these different places and I talked to Hindu people and I talked to Buddhist people, I'm like, well, how do you teach them about Buddhism? They're like, oh, like we read a story, like a story from the Buddha or a Buddhist story, and then we do a craft. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's exactly the same way, right? So I realized that this is how people always teach the young people is through story, right? And so these are the stories. These are the stories that these folks use to teach kids in their tradition. And so I wrote my own versions of them. And so that's how that book came to be. I read hundreds of stories and chose basically my favorites because it's my book. So I can choose the stories I want. And then this book, the ABCs book, is so funny. It's dedicated to the business partner of my husband. She doesn't even know the book is dedicated to her. She's not going to find out until tomorrow. She's coming over to my house and I'm going to give her a copy of the book, right? So my husband and I stayed at her beach house on the North Carolina coast, right? And it was just my husband and me, and it was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. So we thought it was great fun. Like, I'll just use the other bathroom, right? We don't have 2 bathrooms at home. We're like stuck together in the same bathroom. We've been married 27 years. It's all good. But here we are. I'll use the second bathroom. So I go into the second bathroom and she's got one of those beach posters up, right? And it's the alphabet. Like, I don't know. A is for albatross. B is for beach. C is for crab. D is for dolphin. And I was like, oh my gosh, I could do that for the world's religions. And so I literally came home from the beach house and I started laying it all out. And the illustrator for this book, I had 2 illustrators for this book, but one of them, Raman Bhardwaj, grew up in India. And so I hired him to do the Asian stories, like those stories from Hinduism and Buddhism and Sikhism. He did those stories, and he actually knows these religious traditions. And he's a great artist. He lives in Greenville. He lives in Greensboro, North Carolina now. And so I hired him. And so he was my illustrator for this book. And so I laid out the book, showed it to my friends. I have lots of people I can ask if my information is correct. And then I got Raman to do the illustrations for me. He was available. Probably he wanted the money and he was available. And so it worked out. And so, yeah, so that's how I have a lot of ideas. I'm sure I'll die before I get to them all, but every once in a while something works out and I'm happy about that.
Oh, this has just been wonderful. Now I'm wondering, do you have like a grandparent package on your website?
Well, I don't, but I'm feeling like I should. I actually told a friend the other day, I'm like, I'm thinking about calling AARP and asking how much ads are on their website and in their magazine. And someone said it's not a bad idea. So it's kind of coming out that grandparents are really interested. And also, let's be honest, grandparents are on Facebook, right? And so I get a lot of responses. And so I'm actually thinking about that, how can I make that sort of easy now that I actually, I know I'm not going to get my job at Jubilee back, and I have this part-time job at another church. And like a lot of other people, trying to figure out what my post-pandemic life looks like, right? But also now I have a bunch of stuff, right? I have a 4-volume curriculum that's published and 3 books. And if you keep working hard all day, every day, I don't know, after 10 years, maybe you have something to show for it. I don't know. That's not always true. But so, yeah, I'm kind of getting a large enough sort of tool chest, right? Set of resources where I could sort of create something.
Yeah. It seems like something that will be valuable under the Christmas tree. Whereas 40% of the gifts at Christmas are in landfills within 6 months.
Oh gosh.
That makes me pretty sad. You have a couple questions here. Christy Michaels is with us. She is a priestess with a.
Hi, I'm sorry.
Hey, Christy, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I've got an echo of it. It's playing on something. I don't know if you can hear it or not. I hope you can.
You actually sound okay to us.
Oh, okay, great, perfect. Because I can't figure out how to turn it off. Anyway, I'm a grandmother, and I was working this afternoon and I've been watching your show on Facebook. I mean, it's live on Facebook.
Yep.
Because I couldn't find the link. Oh. So finally I figured out what the link was. So anyway, I'm writing a book for my granddaughter.
Ooh.
Because I do a lot of work with the priestess community, and my work has to do with the suppression of Mary Magdalene and all the research that's come out about her. And that's like incredibly important to realize how we would have been if my mother had known this. She would have said, let me teach you about the empowered divine feminine. And she would have taught me and read me stories on that. And we don't have those stories. So that's what and one of them has to do with the suppressed material about her, why she had her own awakening that's illustrated in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And I discovered it from the Little Mermaid movie, because there's a painting of Mary Magdalene on the Little Mermaid. And so Noel and Bob, I would love to come on again and tell you the Little Mermaid story, because it's you've seen my Disney mystical stories. Well, this one's a really amazing one, that Mary Magdalene is in the movie The Little Mermaid. And when I saw this Renaissance painting in the little, that was in the Little Mermaid, it was like, I got really curious, like, why did they pick that painting to use? There's hundreds of Magdalene Renaissance paintings. Why would they pick that one? Turns out that is a painting that is three different paintings that illustrate, for people who can't read, because at the time of the Renaissance, most people, the lay people, couldn't read, of how she went step by step to go within, connect with her higher self, and become a fully awakened, fully conscious anthropos being. And it outlines it in the visuals of the graphics. So that's the story that I tell. And so, yeah, I would love to talk, because I don't know anything about publishing a book. So I may want to pick your brain.
Well, I'm more than
and I don't know
happy.
if you have the priestess path, but it's right now they're saying it's the fastest rising group. Jean Houston started a mystery school back about 20 years ago, or 30, maybe even 30 years ago. And nobody had heard about mystery schools, but now they're like a dime a dozen. They're like popping up all over, because people are having their awakenings, and they're going to Egypt, and the suppressed material is now coming out. And
well, Christy, we may have to have you back on, but
that's right. Well, any awakening is a good awakening, as far as I'm concerned. I actually, one of the units of my curriculum for the older kids, for the upper elementary and middle school kids, I had developed a unit on women of the Bible, right? Because we don't know a lot about them, but there are a number. I mean, I had enough to make a whole unit. And I used to write every month for the Interfaith Observer, kind of doing sort of the kids beat. And so I've written at least one blog post about how to teach the divine feminine to kids. And that's another thing, it's kind of like prayer, right? Like, they have no problem with this, right? This is when we need to sort of, it's not like you have all these grownups who need to like refigure out the way the world works. Kids are just like, oh yeah, men, women, okay, it's all good. Women priestesses, okay. It's all good with, as far as they're concerned. We just need to keep that, right? We need to figure out how not to wreck it.
Exactly. Well, I want to close here with a message from Carol. She had to drop off because of family duty. She says, this is clarifying how my work tries to overcome the misunderstanding of diversity is through rituals based in one common story, 13.8 billion year universe story that includes and honors all religions. I'm thinking your passion, Vicki, and expertise would enrich what I'm doing. Thank you, and so many congratulations.
Oh, she's so sweet. I know her through creation spirituality communities, and I've known her for many years, and she's always been so supportive, and she's just so sweet and wonderful. And I think that's what we all have to do, right? We all have to take our passion and put our drop of good into the world, and help make this world a better place. I mean, that's why we're here.
Well, you bring us so much joy. Thank you so much, Vicki. And I'm looking forward to that grandparent pack.
Yeah, I know you're inspiring me. And thank you again for having me on. You guys are so awesome. I love what you do. I so appreciate you. And at some point, yes, we will see each other in Asheville.
That's right. We're gonna meet up and
yep, time to cross that mountain and come over.
That's right. That's right. Do it before it starts snowing.
Right.
Or after it stops snowing. Either way.
Right.
Probably at this point we have to wait till the springtime.
Asheville's beautiful in the snow. Yep.
No, that's true.
If you don't have to drive.
Yeah.
Thank
you for being here
tonight. We had quite a few on Facebook. I know there's others that are going to pick it up on our archives that Bob is a custodian of and guardian. And thank you so much, Vicki. Always a delight to be with you. I just love it.
Thank you so much.
And forget it. I'm not getting those books for the kids. I'm getting them for myself.
All right. I'm fine with that.
Can you put her information in the chat again? Because I'm late to the chat. So.
Sure. Yeah, but thank you.
Well, Christy, if you're on Facebook, I'll find you and we can be friends on Facebook too.
Yeah, Christy Grace Michaels.
Yep.
There you go. Yes, it's World Religions, 4kids.com/children's-books. So thank you, everyone.
All right.
There you go. Give Christy a moment to be able to snag the chat.
Yeah, I already said I'm going to save it. So thank you, dear.
Good.
Okay.
Wonderful.
All right.
All right.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
May peace prevail on earth.
Yes.
Good night. Thank you again.
Bye.